The wind was not wind anymore. It was a weapon. It struck with the force of a battering ram, driving snow so dense and so fast that a man caught in it would be blind, deaf, and frozen within minutes. The temperature had dropped to 37 degrees below zero, and the wind chill, a concept that the people of Thornfield, Nebraska, did not yet have a name for but understood intimately, made it colder still. To step outside was to invite death. To walk from one building to another, a distance of perhaps 50 feet, was to gamble with certainty that the house would not guide you, that the wind would spin you around, that you would wander until you fell and did not rise. On the morning of January 13th, 1888, 17-year-old Emmeline Porter opened the back door of her family's farmhouse and stepped into the storm to fetch water from the well. The well was 40 feet away. She knew the path by heart. She had walked it 10,000 times. But the blizzard erased all paths, all memory, all direction. Her family found her body 3 days later, 200 yards from the house, facing away from safety, her arms still reaching forward as if she believed home was just ahead. Emmeline was not the only one. Across the northern plains, the schoolhouse blizzard killed over 200 people, many of them within sight of their own doorsteps. The storm was a monster that devoured the familiar, turning backyards into killing fields, transforming the simple act of walking into a death sentence. But in the small cluster of homesteads on the eastern edge of Thornfield, not a single life was lost. 31 people, men, women, and children, survived the 3-day storm without once setting foot in the open air. They moved between houses, barns, wells, and root cellars through a network of tunnels that ran beneath the frozen earth, safe from the wind that howled impotently above their heads. The man who had dug those tunnels was named Garrett Holbrook, and until the storm proved him right, they had called him mad. He had come to Nebraska in the spring of 1881, a widower of 43, whose wife, Lenora, had perished in the hard winter of 79, caught in a blizzard between the house and the barn on their Minnesota homestead. She had gone to milk the cows at dusk, a task she had performed 1,000 times before. The storm had risen without warning, as plain storms so often did, and she had lost her way in the 20-yard space between the barn door and the kitchen. Garrett had found her the next morning, frozen solid, her hand outstretched toward a house she could not see. He had never forgiven himself. He had never stopped thinking about those 20 yards. Nebraska was supposed to be a fresh start. He filed a claim on 160 acres of prairie east of Thornfield, paying the standard fee, building the standard sod house, starting the standard life of a plains homesteader. His sorrel gelding, Dusty, pulled the plow that broke the land. His hands, still strong despite his years, built the fences and the outbuildings. He worked from dawn to dark, as all homesteaders did, trying to outrun a grief that followed him like a shadow. But even as he built the structures that a farm required, the house, the barn, the chicken coop, the root cellar, the well house, he was planning something else. Something that no one in Thornfield would understand until it saved their lives. He was planning tunnels. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Whether you're on the plains, in the mountains, or somewhere the wind howls just as fierce. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when walking outside becomes impossible. The first tunnel connected his house to his barn. He began digging in June of 1881, working in the cool of the morning and the twilight of the evening, when the sun was not brutal and the soil was not baked. The prairie earth was not easy. It was dense with roots, studded with rocks, resistant to the shovel in ways that tested even his considerable determination. But Garrett was patient. He had learned patience from grief, and grief had taught him well. He dug down 5 feet, then forward, shoring up the tunnel walls with timber cut from the cottonwoods along the creek. The passage was 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall, cramped but large enough for a man to walk hunched or for animals to be led through in emergency. He lined the floor with gravel for drainage and installed simple wooden doors at each end to control airflow and keep out vermin. The tunnel was 60 feet long. It took him 3 months to complete. When he emerged from the barn end on a September morning, squinting in the sunlight, his neighbor to the north, a prosperous farmer named Cyrus Pemberton, happened to be riding past. Pemberton was the wealthiest man in the Thornfield settlement, owner of 320 acres, and employer of 2 hired men. He considered himself the natural leader of the community, and he had opinions about everything. "Holbrook," Pemberton called, reining in his bay mare. "What in God's name are you building? A grave?" "A tunnel," Garrett replied. "Connects the house to the barn." Pemberton stared at him. Then he laughed, a loud, braying laugh that carried across the prairie. "A tunnel? You've dug a tunnel to your barn, 60 feet underground so you don't have to walk 60 feet above ground." He shook his head in amazement. "The sun has cooked your brain, man. That's the only explanation." Word of Garrett's tunnel spread through Thornfield within days. At the general store, at the church, at the schoolhouse where the children gathered to learn their letters, the Minnesota widower and his underground passage became the subject of endless amusement. "Holbrook's digging to China," the men joked at the store. "He means to become a mole," the women whispered at the sewing circle. "The mole man," the children called him, giggling behind their hands. Cyrus Pemberton, who enjoyed his role as the community's leading citizen, made Garrett's project a personal crusade. "The man is not right in the head," Pemberton declared at a gathering at his homestead, where the leading families had assembled for a harvest celebration. "First his wife freezes to death, and now he spends his days underground like some kind of burrowing creature. It's unhealthy, unnatural, and frankly, it's an embarrassment to the settlement." His wife, Prudence, nodded vigorously. "I feel sorry for him. Truly I do. The grief has clearly unhinged him. But tunnels? Whatever will people think?" The laughter and the whispers continued. But Garrett did not stop. He could not stop. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lenora reaching for a door she could not find. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. Through 1882 and 1883, Garrett expanded his tunnel system. A second passage connected the house to the well house, ensuring that water could be fetched without stepping outside. A third ran from the barn to the chicken coop. A fourth led to the root cellar, where provisions could be retrieved in any weather. His homestead became an underground web, 400 feet of tunnel linking every structure on his property. The cost in labor was enormous. The cost in materials was substantial. Timber for shoring, gravel for flooring, doors and hardware, and the endless small necessities of construction. But Garrett had no wife, no children, no obligations beyond his own survival. He spent his money on lumber instead of luxuries, his time on digging instead of socializing. The neighbors watched with a mixture of pity and scorn. The tunnels became a local legend, a cautionary tale about what happened when a man let grief consume his reason. But Garrett was not content with his own property. In the spring of 1884, he approached his nearest neighbor, a young couple named Ansel and Bette Lindgren, who had claimed the quarter section to the south. The Lindgrens were struggling, as most young homesteaders did, trying to establish themselves on land that demanded everything and forgave nothing. They had a 2-year-old daughter, Sonia, and another child on the way. "I want to dig a tunnel between our properties," Garrett told them. "A passage that would connect your root cellar to my barn in case of emergency." Ansel Lindgren was polite, but puzzled. Emergency? Blizzard, fire, anything that makes going outside dangerous. If you could reach my place underground, you'd have options. Shelter if yours fails. Help if you need it. The tunnel would be there. The Lindgrens exchanged glances. They had heard the stories about the mole man. But Garrett was offering to do all the work himself, at no cost to them, asking nothing in return. They agreed, more out of bewilderment than conviction. The tunnel between the properties took 5 months to complete. It was 200 feet long, properly shored and drained, with doors at each end. When it was finished, the Lindgrens could walk from their root cellar to Garrett's barn without once seeing daylight. Word of this new tunnel rekindled the mockery. "Holbrook's connecting the whole territory," Pemberton announced with disgust. First his own buildings, now his neighbors. The man means to turn Nebraska into a rabbit warren. But something unexpected happened. The Lindgrens, despite their initial skepticism, found the tunnel useful. During a fierce thunderstorm in June of 1885, when lightning struck the prairie and fires raced across the dry grass, Bet took the children through the tunnel to Garrett's stone-walled barn while Ansel fought the flames. The barn was safer than their sod house, and the tunnel let them reach it without crossing the fire's path. Betty told the other women about it. Ansel mentioned it to the men at the general store. The mockery did not stop, but it grew quieter, tempered by the reluctant admission that the crazy tunnel had actually proven useful. Other neighbors began approaching Garrett. The Kowalski family, to the east, asked if he might connect their well house to the Lindgrens' property, creating a link in the growing chain. Old Henrik Dahl, who lived alone north of Pemberton's spread, wondered if perhaps a tunnel might reach his cabin from the Kowalski barn. He was getting too old to walk far in winter, and the isolation frightened him. Garrett agreed to every request. Through 1885 and 1886, he dug. The tunnel network grew, a branching web that connected 6 homesteads, allowing movement between properties without exposure to the elements. Each family contributed what they could, whether labor or timber, or simply meals for the man who spent his days underground. The passages were not elegant, but they were solid. They worked. Cyrus Pemberton watched the growing network with increasing irritation. The tunnels had become a kind of community project, organized around the very man Pemberton had dismissed as a lunatic. Worse, they connected the smaller homesteaders in a way that excluded him. His own property, the largest and most prosperous in the settlement, remained an island, unconnected to the web. He had been offered a connection, of course. Garrett had approached him in the fall of 1886, proposing a tunnel that would link Pemberton's barn to the Dahl property, completing a circuit that would connect every homestead in the eastern settlement. "I will not," Pemberton had declared, drawing himself up to his full height, "participate in this foolishness. My buildings are properly constructed. My workers are capable of walking 50 feet without becoming lost. I do not need tunnels, Mr. Holbrook. and I will not have them dug beneath my land. Garrett had accepted the refusal without argument. The network would be incomplete, but it would serve those who wanted it. That would have to be enough. If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. The winter of 1887 to 88 began mild. December was cold, but not brutal, and the snow fell in manageable amounts that the wind distributed evenly across the prairie. The homesteaders went about their business, tending stock, mending equipment, preparing for the spring that would eventually come. The talk at the general store was of prices and politics, not weather. January 12th dawned warm, unseasonably, almost impossibly warm. The temperature climbed into the 40s, and the snow that had accumulated began to soften and sag. Children were sent to school in light coats. Farmers ventured out to check on stock. The whole prairie seemed to relax, grateful for a respite from winter's grip. Garrett felt the change and did not trust it. He had learned to read the prairie's moods, and this warmth felt wrong. Too sudden, too complete, like the smile of a man who was about to pull a knife. He spent the morning checking his tunnel doors, ensuring that the passages were clear, that the lamps were filled, that the system was ready for whatever might come. The storm struck at mid-afternoon. It arrived without warning, a wall of cold and snow that rolled across the prairie like an avalanche made of air. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in less than an hour. The wind rose from a whisper to a scream, driving snow horizontally, reducing visibility to zero. Day became darkness. The world outside disappeared. The Lindgren family was the first to use the tunnels. Ansel had been in the barn when the storm hit, separated from his wife and children by 40 yards of open ground. In a normal blizzard, he might have risked the walk, guiding himself by rope or memory. But this was not a normal blizzard. This was annihilation. He stumbled through the barn, found the tunnel entrance, and emerged in Garrett's barn 15 minutes later, shaking with cold but alive. From Garrett's barn, another tunnel led to the Kowalski property. From the Kowalskis, a passage ran to the Dahls. From the Dahls, connections branched to the other homesteads in the network. The system that Pemberton had called madness became a lifeline, allowing families to reunite, supplies to be shared, help to reach those who needed it. Old Henrik Dahl had fallen on the ice that morning before the storm and had injured his hip. He could not walk, could barely move. In a normal blizzard, he would have lain in his cabin alone, hoping for rescue that might come too late. But the tunnels changed everything. The Kowalski boys reached him within an hour of the storm's arrival, bringing food and blankets and the simple comfort of human presence. They stayed with him through the 3 days of howling darkness, keeping his fire fed, keeping him alive. Bette Lindgren, who was 7 months pregnant with her 3rd child, felt the contractions begin on the 2nd night. The baby was not due for weeks, but babies do not follow schedules, and this one was coming regardless of the storm above. Through the tunnels, word spread. Garrett, who had helped deliver calves and foals and had some rough knowledge of midwifery, made his way through the passages to the Lindgren homestead. He arrived in time to help bring a healthy baby boy into the world, a boy who would have been born in a house with only a terrified young father in attendance if the tunnels had not existed. For 3 days, the network functioned as Garrett had designed it. 31 people moved between homesteads without once stepping into the storm that raged overhead. Food was shared. Firewood was distributed. The sick were tended. The frightened were comforted. The isolated were connected. The system held. On the Pemberton property, a quarter-mile away from the nearest tunnel entrance, the situation was very different. Cyrus Pemberton had 4 people to account for: himself, his wife Prudence, and his 2 hired men, Gustav and Peton. When the storm struck, Pemberton was in his house. Gustav was in the barn. Peton was somewhere between, walking back from the well house with a bucket of water. Peton never arrived. They found his body 2 days after the storm broke, 100 feet from the barn, the bucket still clutched in his frozen hands. Gustav, trapped in the barn without food or adequate clothing, survived by burrowing into the hay and sharing warmth with the horses. He lost 3 toes to frostbite. Pemberton and his wife huddled in their grand house, the largest house in the settlement, the house that was supposed to represent the pinnacle of prairie prosperity, and burned their furniture to stay warm when the coal ran out. They had plenty of provisions, but no way to reach their other buildings, no connection to neighbors who might have helped, no option but to wait and pray. When the storm finally broke on the morning of January 15th, Cyrus Pemberton emerged from his house a changed man. His hired man was dead. His other worker was crippled. His wife had developed a cough that would linger for months. His grand house was half emptied of furniture, burned to ashes in the grate. He looked east toward the cluster of homesteads that had survived intact. He knew what had saved them. He knew who had built it. The walk to Garrett Holbrook's cabin was the longest of his life. Garrett was outside, clearing snow from the tunnel vents, when Pemberton approached. The 2 men faced each other in the brilliant winter sunshine, their breath pluming white, the silence between them heavy with everything that had happened. "Peton is dead," Pemberton said. His voice was flat, stripped of its usual bluster. He was 23 years old. He came from Poland to make a new life. He died walking from the well to the barn. Garrett said nothing. He had known loss. He understood what it cost. "I called you mad," Pemberton continued. "I laughed at your tunnels. I refused to let you dig on my land. I was proud and I was stupid, and a man is dead because of it." Still, Garrett said nothing. "My wife wants to leave," Pemberton said. "She says she cannot bear another winter here. But He stopped, his voice breaking. "I have nowhere else to go. This is my land, my life, everything I built." He drew a ragged breath. "Will you teach me? Will you help me build tunnels on my property? I'll pay whatever you ask. I'll do whatever work you require. Just, please, help me make sure this never happens again." Garrett studied the man who had mocked him for 7 years. The proud landowner, the self-appointed leader, the voice that had called him mole man and burrowing creature, an embarrassment to the settlement. That man was gone. In his place stood someone smaller, humbler, broken by a lesson that should never have needed teaching. "I don't want your money," Garrett said finally, "and I won't dig tunnels only for your property. The network needs to connect everyone, or it doesn't work. You were the missing piece. Without a link through your land, we couldn't reach the homesteads to the west." He paused. "If you agree to let me dig across your property, a main passage that connects the eastern network to the western settlers, I'll help you build whatever tunnels you need for yourself. No charge, just cooperation." Pemberton's eyes filled with tears he did not bother to hide. "Yes," he whispered, "whatever you need." Yes. A gathering was held at the schoolhouse 2 weeks after the blizzard, when the dead had been buried and the injured had begun to heal. The settlement came together to mourn the 3 souls who had been lost across the wider Thornfield area, including Emmeline Porter, the 17-year-old who had died walking to her own well. But they also came to acknowledge what had been saved. Mayor Wilkins, who served as the informal leader of the Thornfield community, addressed the assembly with a gravity that the occasion demanded. 31 people survived the storm in the eastern settlement, he said. 31 people who were able to move between homesteads, share resources, help each other, without once stepping into the killing wind. They survived because one man, 7 years ago, started digging tunnels that the rest of us called madness. He turned to Garrett, who stood at the back of the room, as uncomfortable with attention as he had ever been. Mr. Holbrook, you lost your wife to a blizzard. You could have let that loss destroy you. Instead, you let it teach you. You built something that saved lives, including lives that belonged to people who laughed at you, who mocked you, who called you mad. His voice thickened. We were wrong, all of us, and we are grateful. Cyrus Pemberton rose next. He walked to the front of the room, his gait still unsteady from the 3 days of fear and cold he had endured. I led the mockery, he said, his voice barely audible. I called him the Mole Man. I refused to let him dig on my land. I said his tunnels were an embarrassment to the settlement. He stopped, gathering himself. My hired man is dead because of my pride. My other worker will never walk right again. My wife may never forgive me for the fear I put her through. He turned to face Garrett. Mr. Holbrook, you offered to help me, and I refused. You offered to connect my property to the network, and I called it foolishness. You tried to save my people, and I turned you away. His voice cracked. I cannot undo what I did. I can only promise to do better, and I can say, before everyone here, that I was a fool, and you were a prophet, and I am sorry. The room was silent. Then, slowly, others began to rise. Families who had laughed at the tunnels and then survived because of them. Neighbors who had whispered about the Mole Man and then sent their children through his passages to safety. One by one, they offered their acknowledgement, their apology, their thanks. When the confessions were complete, Garrett walked to the front of the schoolhouse. He was not a man of words, had never been comfortable with speeches, but some things needed to be said. My wife died 40 yards from our front door, he said quietly. 40 yards. I found her the next morning with her hand outstretched, reaching for a home she could not see. I have thought about those 40 yards every day for 9 years. He looked around the room. The tunnels are not madness. They are memory. They are my promise to Lenora that no one else will die reaching for a door they cannot find. He paused. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn. The digging is hard, but it is not complicated. The materials are not expensive. The work can be shared. Every homestead in this settlement can be connected if we do it together. He drew a breath. The storm will come again. It always does. The question is whether we will be ready. Thank you for watching this story about Garrett Holbrook and the tunnel network of Thornfield. When the familiar becomes deadly, only the prepared survive. If this story reminded you that what looks like madness is sometimes simply foresight, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever called you crazy for preparing against a danger others refuse to see? That summer, Thornfield began to dig. Under Garrett's supervision, the tunnel network expanded from 6 connected homesteads to 17. The main passage through Pemberton's land, the link that joined the eastern and western portions of the settlement, was completed in August, creating a continuous underground route that stretched nearly a mile. Cyrus Pemberton worked alongside the crews, swinging a pick and hauling dirt, doing the labor he had once considered beneath him. His wife Prudence stayed in the end, finding in the community effort a sense of purpose that her isolated prosperity had never provided. They never spoke of Piotr without grief, but they honored his memory by ensuring that no one else would die the way he had. The phrase "digging a hole brook" entered the vocabulary of the Nebraska prairie. It meant building connections between people, creating passages that would hold when the surface failed. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker understood something about foresight that could only be learned through loss. Garrett Holbrook lived to see the Great Blizzard of 1899, which struck the same territory with similar fury. By then, the Thornfield network included 32 connected homesteads, with over 3 miles of underground passages. Not a single life was lost in the settlement. The children who had once called him Mole Man were adults now, and they called him something different. They called him the Man Who Remembered. He passed in the spring of 1903 at the age of 65 and was buried beside Lenora on the Minnesota homestead where she had died reaching for home. His body was returned there by his request. He had never stopped loving the woman who taught him, through her death, how to save others. The tunnel entrance nearest his Nebraska cabin bears a marker that the settlement placed there in 1904. The inscription is simple: "He built paths where there were none." Lenora, reaching in the dark, would have understood perfectly.